I'm going to introduce the talk, though, by talking about a phenomenon, a really tragic phenomenon, that has been occurring in the United States over the last 60 years. And I really am serious when I say this is a tragedy. What has been happening over the last 60 years in the United States is that children have gradually become less and less free. Their time to play has been taken away from them. One of the historians of play in the United States, a man named Howard Chudakoff, in a book about the history of play in America, says that the golden age of play in America for children, really the golden age for children, was the first half of the 20th century. That was the time after which children, for the most part, were not involved in intense child labor. We had passed laws against child labor. And so children had a lot of free time to play and explore the way children are really designed to do. Children are supposed to be playing and exploring. That's how they learn. That's how they grow. And so now they had a lot of opportunity to do that. But beginning in the middle of the 20th century, rather, I'm talking about the first half of the 20th century was the golden age of play. Beginning in the middle of the 20th century, adults began to take children's freedom away. And they did that in a number of ways. They did it by increasing the amount of time they were in school, by increasing the obligations of schooling, by creating activities outside of school that were really sometimes called play, but they weren't really play. They were really adult-directed activities, very much like school. By, in some ways, forbidding children from just going outdoors to play freely as they always had in the past, because people began to feel like it was dangerous for children to be out unprotected by adults. So there was this gradual decline in children's freedom, and it was really gradual, but over the course of a 60-year period, from about 1955 until now, it was a huge decline. There's no comparison between the amount of freedom that I had when I was a child in the 1950s in America and the amount of freedom that the typical child today has in America. When I was a child, we did have school, but school was not a big deal. We were free to play and explore from about 3 o'clock on to the rest of until dark, all weekend long, all summer long. Summer vacation was 5 weeks longer than it is now. We didn't have homework, certainly not in elementary school. There was some homework in high school, but it wasn't a big deal. So we had school, but it didn't monopolize our time. We had lots of time to play and explore. This has been documented in a number of different ways, but as I just said, I'm old enough that I've seen that change in the course of my lifetime. And I'm, of course, not the only one who comments on that. In my book, I have a quotation from Hilary Clinton, the woman who, of course, was Secretary of State for the United States, First Lady before that, ran for president and didn't win. But let me quote from her. She's about my age. And here's what she writes about her own childhood. We had a well-organized kids' society, and we had all kinds of games, playing hard every day after school, every weekend, and from dawn until our parents made us come in at dark in the summertime. One game was called Chase and Run, which was a kind of complex team-based hide-and-seek and tag camp combination. We would make up teams and disperse throughout the entire neighborhood for maybe a 2 or 3 block area, designating safe places that you could get to if somebody was chasing you. There were also ways of breaking the hold of a tag so that you could get back in the game. As with all of our games, the rules were elaborate, and they were hammered out in long consultations on street corners. It was how we spent countless hours. We were so independent. We were given so much freedom. But now it's impossible to imagine giving that to a child today. It's one of the great losses of our society. I would say it's a tragic loss of our society, and I'm going to explain why. I go on and just comment here. I'll also just read my comment on this. Regardless of which side of the political fence you are on, you will agree that Hilary Clinton grew up to be an extraordinarily competent, confident, and socially adept adult. When I think of Secretary Clinton hammering out agreements among world leaders, I imagine next to her a little girl hammering out agreements with neighborhood kids about the rules for chase and run. I really believe that Hilary Clinton learned a lot more about negotiation, a lot more about problem solving, a lot more about how to get along with people in play with other children than she learned in law school, for example. It's really in play that we acquire those kinds of characteristics that enable us to function as effective adults in the larger world. Now, over this same period of time, this 60-year period where children's freedom to just go out and play with other children without adults controlling them, over this same period of time in the United States, there's been a gradual but overall increase in all sorts of mental disorders in childhood and in young adulthood. And I think there's a cause-effect relationship. So, for example, the most well-documented increases in mental disorders are for depression and for anxiety. There are certain clinical assessment scales for depression and anxiety which have been given to normative groups of young, of high school-age children, of college-age children over the years in unchanged form. And if you, based upon those scales, if you were to look at what would be the cutoff for what today would be probably diagnosed as major depressive disorder, the rate of major depressive disorder among school-age children is about 8 times today what it was in the 1950s, about 8 times as much. Similarly, with anxiety disorders, there are scales assessing the degree to which you report feeling anxiety and how incapacitating that anxiety is. The level, the rate of what today would be diagnosed as clinically significant anxiety disorder, again, is somewhere between 5 and 10 times what it was in the 1950s. The suicide rate among children age 15 and under is now 4 times what it was in the 1950s. The suicide rate for young people between age 15 and age 24 is more than twice what it was in the 1950s. And in fact, it's probably more than that now because it's recently shot up some more. The suicide rate for people from age 24 to about 40 has increased just a little bit. The suicide rate for people from 40 on has decreased. The suicide rate for people my age, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, has declined greatly. At least in America, we've become, by these measures, a better place for us old people, but a much worse place for children. And to me, that's tragic. That's absolutely tragic, that we have made changes in the culture that are causing children to be unhappy, that are causing them to feel depressed, that are in some cases, rare cases admittedly, but it should never happen, in some cases causing them even to kill themselves. I think there's a cause-effect relationship between the decline in children's freedom and the rise in these disorders. And I'm going to explain as I go about talking about what I believe accounts for that cause-effect relationship. I should say at the beginning that I think that there's a number of reasons for this decline in children's freedom, and we can talk about that in the discussion afterwards, because I think the same things apply here. The same things apply throughout the world. This is not a uniquely American problem. This is a problem that applies here. This is a problem that applies in much of Europe. It's certainly a problem in the UK. It's a problem in Australia. It's just that the research that I've done and the research that I'm aware of has taken place in the United States. And the history that I've observed took place in the United States because that's where I grew up. So in addition to this increase in depression and anxiety and the increase in suicide, there's another very interesting clinical questionnaire that has been given in unchanged form ever since about 1960. And this is a questionnaire that's called the Internal-External Locus of Control Scale. And what it assesses is the degree to which you feel that you are in control of your own life versus the degree to which you feel that you are kind of a victim of fate and circumstances and other people's decisions and control. To the degree that you have this sense that you control your own fate, that's called an internal sense of control. The degree that you feel like you are being controlled by other people, that's called an external locus of control. Now, one thing that psychologists know, there's a lot of evidence for this, is that it's a good thing to have an internal sense of control. People who have that internal sense of control are generally psychologically healthy. They are generally happy, they are less likely to become depressed or anxious as life goes on because they have this feeling that they can solve problems. They don't feel helpless in the face of problems. Now, it's very interesting that ever since this locus of control scale has been given, the internal sense of control has been declining in school-age children and in young adults. Isn't that interesting? Even though over this historical period, you would think that people would have more of an internal sense of control. There are more things we realistically can control now than was true in the 1950s. There are diseases, for example, that we can control now that we couldn't control in the 1950s in America. And if, depending upon what race you are or what sex you are, you have a lot more choice of what you can do now than was true back in the 1950s, at least in America. So one would think that the internal sense of control would have increased, but it hasn't. It's decreased. Young people are growing up with less of a feeling that they're in control of their own lives now than they were back in the 1950s. And this has been a change that has been a gradual change over this same time period that free play has declined. So here's what I think is kind of a cause-effect relationship. I think that the way you learn that you can control your own life is when you actually have practice controlling your own life. And for children, where you have practice controlling your own life is in play. Play away from adults, where nobody's controlling you, where you have to make your own decisions, where you have to solve your own problems, where you have to take care of yourself and your playmates. That's where you learn, I can do things. Problems can arise and I can rise up and solve these problems. That's how you develop an internal locus of control. So here's my kind of view of the causal chain. No play, always being controlled by other people, always having other people telling you what you're supposed to do, always being judged and evaluated by other people, by adults, you don't develop an internal sense of control. You don't develop an internal sense of control, and that sets you up for anxiety and depression, because if you don't feel you can control things, it is a very frightening world, and it's a very depressing world. And the world without play is all by itself a depressing world. So to me, it's no surprise at all that as play has declined, depression and anxiety and suicide have increased in the United States. More bad news. Not only has depression and anxiety increased and sense of control decreased, but there are also some other clinical questionnaires that show changes that are very tragic to observe. One of the changes, beginning about 1970, psychologists developed questionnaires to assess empathy and to assess narcissism. Empathy refers to the ability or the tendency to experience other people's feelings. So if I empathize with you, I sort of feel your pain when you have pain, and I sort of also feel your joy when you are feeling joyful. And therefore, I am motivated to reduce your pain and to increase your joy because I can kind of sense it as in you. I'm feeling it. That's empathy. Biologically oriented psychologists like me consider empathy really to be the biological root for morality. The reason we care about other people's pain and joy is because in some sense they cause pain and joy in ourselves when we see pain in somebody else or joy in somebody else. So a world without as much empathy would not be as good a world as a world where people are empathic. Narcissism is sort of the opposite of empathy. Narcissism was where really all I'm concerned about is myself. I don't really care that much about you. You're just kind of a tool for me to use for my own exaltation. Narcissists don't make good connections with other people because they're so wrapped up in themselves that they can't really get into the minds of another person and be helpful and cooperative in a truly meaningful way with other people. So given all that, it's sad to see that based on these questionnaires, ever since they've been used, narcissism has been increasing and empathy has been decreasing among young people in the United States. And again, I'm going to argue that I think that comes from the lack of play because I think it's in play that children overcome narcissism and learn to empathize with their playmates. So yet one more thing that has occurred in the United States. You know, in the United States, one of the things that we've always prided ourselves on in the United States is we think that we're a very creative people. We have more Nobel Prize winners per capita than any other place. We write these great novels. We are imaginative, we're innovative, we're creative. It's very sad, therefore, to see that over the years since about the data only go back as far as 1980. Over the years since 1980, creativity has been going down. How do we know that creativity has been going down? This is going to sound odd, but there's actually a questionnaire, a test that assesses creativity. At first I thought, how could you really assess creativity with any kind of a questionnaire or test? But it turns out that there's a set of questions called Torrance's tests of creative thinking, which have been used since about the 1950s, but systematically used to assess normative groups of school children since about 1980 for their ability to think creatively. And this test, at first I questioned whether it would be a valid test, but when I look at the actual data about the test, it turns out to be very valid. It's very good at predicting who is going to make real creative achievements in their life. So children who score high on this test go on, generally speaking, to do really creative things in their lives. They invent new things, they start new companies, they write interesting novels at a much higher rate than people who score lower on that test. This test, it turns out, is the best predictor that we have of future creative achievement. Much better than IQ, much better than grade point average in school, much better than teachers' predictions of who's going to be creative, much better than peer predictions of who's going to be creative. So it's sad to see that over the past at least 30 years, since the mid-1980s, the scores on Torrance's tests have been going down at every single grade level in the United States. So again, why? I think it's because we aren't letting children play. Play is by definition creative. We are having children spend more and more time doing uncreative stuff in school, where they're preparing for tests, where they're doing things that they're told to do, where creativity, if anything, is negative. It decreases their score on the tests. You can't really be creative when you're being tested on something where the job is to feed back what you were told or what was given to you. So I'm arguing that these changes, these negative effects, these negative psychological and cognitive changes in the United States that we have been seeing, I'm arguing it is directly linked to the increase in the weight of schooling and the decrease in the amount of freedom that children have to play and explore. Now, why do I think that? I'm going to argue that these are exactly the changes that one would predict would occur if you know what play is, and you know what the purpose of play is, and you know what the research is about play. These are exactly the changes that you would predict would occur. So now I get to sort of the meat of the talk here. We're now on Roman numeral 2. What exactly is play, and why is it such a powerful vehicle for learning? So let me now turn to really talking about play. Play is a word we use regularly. We talk about children going out to play. But what is it really that we mean? What exactly is play? That's what I want to focus on. The first thing I want to say is that play is a concept that the more we think about it, the more we see certain paradoxes, certain contradictions in our understanding of play. It's not an easy concept to think about and to understand really and truly what it is. We all kind of think that we can recognize play. But when you try to really articulate exactly what is play, it's not so easy. Play is serious, and yet it is not serious. Play is trivial, yet play is profound. Play is imaginative and spontaneous, but yet I'm going to argue play is always bound by rules. There's no such thing as play without rules. The rules might not be stated, they might not be written down, but there are always implicit rules in play. Play is not real. It takes place in the fantasy world, an imaginary world. Yet play, I'm going to argue, is how children learn to cope with the real world. It's always about the real world. It's how children manage the real world is through play. Play is childish, yet I'm going to argue that play underlies the greatest achievements of adults. Almost all of the greatest achievements of adults occur when their adults are playing in a playful mode. From a biological perspective, which is my perspective, we could say that play is nature's way of ensuring that young mammals, and particularly young human beings, practice the kinds of skills that they need to practice to grow up to be effective adults. From a religious perspective, we might say that play is God's gift that makes life on earth worthwhile. And that's the gift that we have been taking away from children by insisting that they be in school all the time, that they be studying all the time, that they be doing the things that we're telling them to do, rather than playing, which is what they want to do, which is what they're biologically predisposed to do. There are certain universal varieties of play. Wherever children are free to play, they play in all of these kinds of ways that I've listed here under universal varieties of play, B under Roman numeral 2 in your handout. There's physical play, locomotor play, running, leaping, climbing, swinging, chasing, rough and tumble. All those kinds of play, these are the kinds of play that we share with other mammals. All mammals, including us, have physical bodies. And children build those physical bodies by playing in physically strenuous ways, climbing trees, chasing one another, wrestling with one another, doing all of these kinds of things that other young mammals also do. And this is how children develop strong hearts and lungs. It's how they burn off calories, how they develop good muscles, how they develop graceful movements. So play of this sort builds the physical body and allows you to control that body in meaningful ways. This kind of play also does another thing. It's how children and other mammals learn courage. In this kind of rough and tumble play and climbing trees and doing things that are dangerous, children are developing courage. They're learning, I can do this thing. I can climb the tree that high, and I can come down and tell the story. We are all at some point in our lives going to face real emergencies, and children in some sense are practicing for those emergencies when they are playing in what look like dangerous ways. They're deliberately putting themselves into situations where they feel a certain amount of fear. And that what are they learning? They're learning, I can feel fear, and I can survive it. I can still control my mind. I don't panic, and I can control my body. And as a result of that, they're much less likely to have anxiety attacks later on, or they're much less likely to feel helpless in a situation of an emergency later on. So that's physical play. The other kinds of play that I've listed here are play that are uniquely human forms of play. All these other things are characteristics that human beings in every culture have to develop, and it's very interesting that children in every culture play in all of these kinds of ways. So there's linguistic play, language play. Children learn language in the context of play. The earliest cooing and babbling is always playful. If you've ever watched a baby just first learning, it's always in a playful tone. The first words are always used in a playful way. They're not used to ask for anything. They're not used seriously. It's always in play. And as children go older, they play in more sophisticated ways with language. And that's how children learn language. They learn it in play. Constructive play. We're the animal, we're the linguistic animal, and we're also the animal that builds things. We're the animals that have opposable thumbs. We survive by building our environment. We build huts. We build tools. Whether it's bows and arrows or computers or whatever it is that we build means of conveyance. We have for millennia been the animal that survives by building things. And it's interesting that children in every culture in play build things in play. What they build depends upon the culture in which they're living. They build the artifacts that are relevant to the culture in which they're living. So they're learning to use their hands and their opposable thumbs in order to build things, and their minds in order to build things. There's also imaginative fantasy play, what researchers call sociodramatic play, when a group of children are playing a kind of make-believe kind of game. Let's pretend we're all witches or superheroes, or we're princesses, or we're playing house and you're the mommy and I'm the daddy and somebody else is the baby and somebody else is the pet dog, and so on and so forth. You're acting out parts and you're acting out a narrative. Children are imagining in that kind of play. Children are exercising what ultimately is the highest form of human reasoning, which is hypothetical reasoning. Let's pretend, let's imagine that this is so. And if this is so, then what else has to be true? All higher order human thinking is that kind of thinking, and children in play are practicing that all the time. There are also games in every culture. There are games with formal rules. I'm going to argue that all games have rules, but some games have formal rules, where the rules are actually stated and they're very clear. They're very precise rules, and you can't violate those rules when you're playing. Human beings in every culture have to abide by rules. We have rules. One of the differences between human beings and other animals is we have to live according to certain rules that we create. And so it's interesting that children in every culture are practicing the following of rules by playing games that involve rules. So these are some of the varieties of play, and they illustrate, just by thinking about those varieties of play, some of the really important things that children are practicing when they play. And children in every culture, when they're free to play, when they have lots of time to play in all of these kinds of ways. So none of this still tells you exactly what play is. I've told you something about the paradoxes of play. I've told you something about the different ways that children play, but I haven't yet defined play. So now let me try to define play. And the way I've developed this definition of play, let me say, is by starting by looking at all of there are various scholars over the years who've written about play. There are a number of classic works about play. And I've looked at how did they define play. What did they identify as play, and what did they identify as not play? And I developed sort of a list of characteristics of play, and then I kind of condensed the list, and I brought some of my own research and observations to bear. And through that means, I developed this 5-part definition of play. So my argument is, first of all, that an activity can be more or less playful. It doesn't have to be either just purely one or the other. But that an activity is pure play to the degree that it has all of the 5 characteristics that I've listed here on the handout and that I'm going to talk about now. So what are these 5 characteristics? The first characteristic of play is that it is self-chosen and self-directed. If somebody else is telling you to do it, or if somebody else is directing it, who's not one of the players, if some adult is there directing it, controlling it, solving the problems, and so on, it's not play. Play is an activity that's chosen by the players and directed by the players. So right off, Little League Baseball or adult-directed soccer games or all of those kinds of things that in our society we sometimes call play are not play, because those are not being directed by the children themselves. Those are more like school, because in those situations, the children are being directed by an adult. It's really the self-directed aspect of play that is really the primary learning aspect of play. You're learning to direct your own behavior. You're learning that you don't need somebody else. You don't need an adult. You don't need an authority figure to direct you. That's how you develop an internal sense of control. You can't develop an internal sense of control if a coach is telling you how to play. You can only develop that if you and your playmates are developing that yourselves. So that's the first defining characteristic of play, and most important one: freely chosen and self-directed. So some of those things that we call play in school, where a teacher is really determining what the game is, and a teacher is really directing it, that's not play. It's okay to do it. It might be a more fun way to learn a lesson, but let's not call it play. It's not play. Second characteristic of play. Well, let me pursue a little bit on this characteristic of play and why it's so important. I said it's self-chosen and self-directed. Now, it's also the case, however, that children almost always prefer to play with other children. Most play throughout the world is social play, children playing together. So when children are playing together, they have to choose together what to play, and they have to decide together how to play. So let's say you and I want to play together, and I want to play this, but you want to play that. And so now we've got to talk it out. I don't want to play what you want to play, and you don't want to play what I want to play, but maybe there's something else that we would both want to play. So we have a discussion. This is how children learn to negotiate. This is how they learn to compromise. This is how they learn, I can't always have it exactly my way, but I can have it kind of my way if I can convince this other person that that she would enjoy too, or he would enjoy it also. This is one of the most important human skills, is how to negotiate with other human beings so you're both getting what you want. You may not, either one of you, be getting what you most want, but you're getting something that you want. And I can't insist that you play my way. Why not? Because if I do, you will just go away. You'll just walk away. The most important freedom in play is freedom to quit. It's not play if you can't quit. If you can't quit, I could bully you. I could make you play my game. You wouldn't have any fun. I might not have that much fun making you play my game. But the fact is, you can quit. It's the quitting that makes play democratic. It's the fact that any player at any time can just quit if they are not having fun, if they believe their wishes are being ignored. So play is the most democratic human activity that there is, precisely because you can always quit if you're not having fun. So if we're going to play together, I've got to learn something really important. I've got to pay attention to whether you're having fun or not. I've got to empathize with you. Because if I fail to empathize with you and I don't notice that you're not having fun, that you aren't enjoying this game, you are going to, at some point, remember that your mom is calling you for dinner and it's time to go home and you're going to leave me there. Because the real reason that you're leaving is that you're not having fun playing with me. So I have to overcome empathy. I have to overcome narcissism and learn empathy in order to play with you. So I think when we have situations where adults are solving all these things and we don't have to learn them as children to solve them ourselves, I think that's why we've seen a decline in empathy and an increase in narcissism over the years among young people. Second defining characteristic of play is that play is motivated by means more than ends. So we're on number 2 here under C, under Roman numeral 2. Play is motivated by means more than ends. To the degree that an activity is done purely to achieve some result, some end result of it, it's not play. So if you're reading a book just so you can get an A on a test, it's not play. If you are running away from a tiger so you don't get eaten by the tiger, it's not play. You're doing it for some kind of a goal. You're doing it, if you're working at a job, at a boring job for a paycheck, it's not play. To the degree that what really matters is the end result of it, then it's not play. In play, what really matters is the means, the activity itself. You're doing it not for the end result. You're doing it for the sake of doing it itself. It's the activity that's self-rewarding. You're doing it for its own sake. Another way of saying this is that it's intrinsically motivated rather than extrinsically motivated. Intrinsically motivated means that the motivation comes from the activity itself. It's self-rewarding. Extrinsically motivated means I'm doing this so that I can get something in the end that's the result of this. Now notice that we've really set up our whole school system so that it's basically all extrinsically motivated. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to do in school in order to pass the course, in order to get an A, in order to get praise, in order to get gold stars, or whatever it is, not internally motivated, so it's not play when it's being done for that purpose. If you were doing the same kind of study and the same kind of work, reading the same books just because you wanted to do it, and because you were really enjoying learning to do it, and you didn't care about any kind of reward at the end, or there was no reward at the end, then we would say it's play. So one of the, play, let me clarify this also a little bit. Play often does have goals. I don't want to say that there is no goals in play. In some play there are clear goals. So for example, in constructive play, the goal is to build the thing that you want to build. But notice that the pleasure of that comes not from having the thing. It's not having the thing that you want. It's the building of the thing. That's where the pleasure. Imagine children on a beach building a sandcastle. This is constructive play. It's not that they want a sandcastle, because the sandcastle is in the end just going to be washed into the sea anyway. It's the building of a sandcastle. And think how intensely their activity will be. They might spend all afternoon building this beautiful sandcastle and have such a wonderful time doing it. And they're not doing it because they want the sandcastle. If somebody were to come along, some adult came along and said, oh, you don't have to do all this hard work of making the sandcastle. I'll make a sandcastle for you. They wouldn't be happy with that because it's not the sandcastle they want, it's the building of the sandcastle. So that's the difference between play and non-play. If they would be happy that somebody else made the sandcastle because they really wanted the sandcastle, then if they were building the sandcastle, it would not be play. In competitive games, let's say children are getting together and they're playing baseball, or they're playing chess, or they're playing any kind of game that's a competitive game where they're winners and losers. There is a goal of scoring points and of winning. but it is the scoring of the points and the winning, and not some consequence of scoring the points and winning, not some trophy that you get afterwards, not praise that you get afterwards, not some mark on your resume, nothing like that. As soon as you have that, as soon as that's the goal, then it's no longer play. Now it's extrinsically motivated rather than intrinsically motivated. Now it's interesting to note there's actually a lot of research that shows that giving rewards for an activity can turn an activity that previously was play into an activity that's no longer play. So let me describe one such experiment. This was a classic experiment that was done many years ago by researchers named Lepper and Green, Mark Lepper and David Green. This was an experiment done in preschools. And what they did is they observed that the children in these preschools during free play liked to play with felt tip pens, with magic markers. And almost all the children would spend a certain amount of time drawing with magic markers just during free play. They enjoyed doing that. So then what the experimenters did is they did this experiment in which they divided the children into two different groups. And one of the groups was rewarded just once for drawing with magic markers, and the other group was not. And the way they did this is the ones that were rewarded just once, they told them, we're going to have a visitor to our classroom, and it would be really nice, and that we would like you to draw a picture for each of you to draw a picture with magic markers for our visitor. And if you do so, you will get this beautiful certificate. It was a very beautiful gold letter certificate that said Good Player Award. And all the children wanted that award, and they all drew a picture for the visitor. But the other group of children were told also that there was going to be a visitor to the classroom. It would be really nice if they drew a picture for the visitor, and they could do that if they wanted to, didn't have to. But nothing was said about a reward, and they didn't get any kind of reward for doing it. All of those children also drew a picture. They wanted to draw a picture for this visitor. All right, so there were two results of this experiment. The first result, and this was the one that they predicted, was when they observed the children for days afterwards. Those children who were rewarded just once for drawing with a magic marker reduced the amount of time that they spent playing with magic markers. Apparently, being rewarded for drawing with magic markers changed their mindset about the meaning of drawing with magic markers. Now it's something you do for a reward. If there's no longer any reward for it, why should I do it anymore? So that was probably it didn't necessarily consciously go through their mind, but that's the researchers' explanation for why that happened. There was one unexpected finding. The unexpected finding was this. The children who drew the picture for a reward drew worse pictures than the ones who did it for no reward. Again, why would that happen? Well, here's an easy explanation. Those who drew it for reward were thinking of this as work. I'm doing this for a reward. There's nothing said that has to be a good picture for reward. I just have to draw a picture for reward. So I'll scribble something down and get a reward. Those who are drawing it for fun, it's no fun to draw a picture unless you're trying to do it well. And so they drew a better picture. There's been many repetitions of this experiment with people of different ages, different kinds of activities, and similar findings are found over and over and over again. When you're doing it in a play context, just for the sake of doing it, you do it better than when you're doing it for a reward. And also, when you're doing it for the sake of play, you continue to do it with no rewards. You continue to do it. It continues to be intrinsically motivated. But if you begin to have to do it for rewards, now it's extrinsically rewarded, and therefore you don't do it very much when you're not getting reward. Well, think of that in relationship to our school system. Everything that we teach children in school, we're giving them rewards or punishments as our means of getting them to do it. We're essentially telling them that all of these things, including many things that otherwise might be fun, reading books, playing with numbers, writing poems, doing all of these kinds of things that could be fun, become work because you're doing it for the reward. You're not doing it just because you enjoy doing it. And we are, in a sense, teaching children that all of these things are work. And we even call it work. We even call it work. You have to do your work before you can go out and play. So the consequence of that is that we are essentially undermining children's intrinsic motivation to do the kinds of things that we believe are important for children to do, that we teach in school. All right, a third characteristic of play is that play is guided by mental rules. Play is freely chosen activity, but it's not free-form activity. It's not random activity. There's always structure in play. Sometimes people talk about unstructured play. There's no such thing as unstructured play. Play is always structured. It's structured by the children themselves. If it's structured by somebody else, it's not play. It has to be structured. So play is always structured, and it's always structured by the players themselves. Either they are creating the structure or they are accepting an already created structure. They're agreeing to a structure. So when they're playing a formal game like chess or checkers or something like that, where the structure is predetermined by the rules, they are agreeing to abide by that structure. But when they're making up their own game, they are creating the structure and then staying within that structure. So and this applies to even the wildest looking forms of play. Imagine a couple of boys chasing one another around the room, wrestling with one another, throwing things at one another, play fighting, wild looking play. It looks from the outside, it looks kind of random and chaotic. Even that play is guided by rules. No kicking, no biting, no scratching. If you are the bigger and stronger of the two, you have to self-handicap. No, you go through the motions of fighting, of hitting one another, of pushing one another, of throwing one another, but you do it in such a way that you don't actually hurt the other person. The play fight is an exercise in restraint. It's an exercise in following rules. Some people look at a play fight and they think it's a real fight and they stop it because it looks like a fight. But in reality, a play fight is the opposite of a fight. It is being in a fight-like situation while not really fighting. The goal in a real fight is to hurt the other person or to subdue the other person or to drive the other person away. The goal in a play fight is to keep it going, to make the other person happy, to keep the play going. It's boys play this way more often than girls, and it's boys' way of learning how to be close with one another and how to engage with one another without actually hurting one another. Play fighting is universal. It's one of the most important forms of play, and it's always an exercise in constraint. Sometimes it goes too far. Sometimes somebody actually does get hurt, and then they get mad, and then they have to figure out what they're going to do. And I'm going to argue later on that's also very important. How do you figure out what to do when somebody actually does get hurt and does get mad, but you want to continue playing? How do you resolve that? So in constructive play, the rule basically is that you're using a certain medium to produce something, some object or some pattern, some design that you have in mind. So it's controlled in that kind of the way. That's the rule. I'm trying to form something that I have in mind. The rules of play are always mental rules. These are ideas that you have in mind, and you're trying to behave in a way that is consistent with those ideas in your mind. Very important skill to develop, which children are always practicing in play. In sociodramatic play, the kind of play that I described before, where maybe children are playing house or they're playing superheroes or whatever, the rule is you have to stay in character. So if you're playing house and you are the pet dog, let's say, then you have to act like a dog. You have to walk around on all fours no matter how uncomfortable it is. No matter how much you want to talk, all you can do is say, arf, arf, arf. You have to act like a dog. You have to control yourself, control your impulses to act like a human being. You have to act like a dog. If you are playing superheroes and you're Wonder Woman in this game, and you believe that Wonder Woman never cries, and you fall down and you skin your knee, you don't cry because Wonder Woman wouldn't cry. Or if you do cry, you call time out first, and then you cry, and then you go back to being Wonder Woman later on. So the idea is that in this kind of play, you are learning this very important human ability to abide by a certain conception of how you ought to behave if you are such and such a person. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky many years ago argued that this is one of the most important skills that children are learning in play, that all of us human beings, we all have to live according to certain roles in our real lives, and those roles change. So right now I'm the lecturer, so I have to play the role of the person giving the lecture. There are certain things that are appropriate for me to do, certain things that are not appropriate for me to do, and I have to keep those in mind and abide by them, keep within that role. You right now are in the audience. In another situation, you might be the lecturer, but right now you're in the audience. You have to play the role of an audience member. It would be inappropriate for you right now to stand up and present a lecture yourself that competes with my lecture. But you know what's appropriate and not appropriate. I know what's appropriate and not appropriate, and we are able to control ourselves to behave in accordance with our social agreement of what's appropriate or not. And that's what children are practicing when they're playing these sociodramatic games. They're practicing playing that kind of way. Vygotsky gave an interesting example. He described the case of two girls who were in real life were sisters, but who sometimes played that they were sisters. So they're really sisters in real life, they're always sisters, but sometimes they play that they're sisters. And he described the difference between being really sisters and playing that they're sisters. When they're really sisters, there was no consistency. Sometimes they argued and squabbled, sometimes they got along with one another, most often they totally ignored one another. But when they were playing that they were sisters, they acted according to a certain stereotyped view of what being sisters meant to them. They walked around, they dressed the same, they walked around with their arms around one another, they loved one another, they hated everybody else, they acted in accordance with a stereotyped view of what it means to be sisters. So children are in a sense deliberately practicing the ability to abide by a certain social role when they are playing these kinds of games. The point I want to make here on this number 3 here about play is guided by mental rules is that every form of play requires a great deal of self-control. Children are learning self-control in play. In order to play, you have to stay within the rules. Your playmates will remind you if you break the rule. If we're rough and tumbling and I break the rule, I hit you too hard, my playmate will remind me, you can't do that. Or if I'm the pet dog and I get up and talk, my playmates will remind me, you're the pet dog, you're not allowed to play that way. So children are learning self-restraint. One of the most, among the most important things that children have to learn to grow up to be adults. Fourth characteristic of play is that play is imaginative. Play always involves at least some element of imagination or fantasy. It's always in some way removed from the real world. Whatever you're playing, you're sort of stepping out of the real world into now this pretend world, this imaginary world. That's most obviously true in the case of fantasy play, where you're playing a narrative, you're playing somebody that you really aren't. That's why we call that imaginary play. But even those kinds of plays that we don't call imaginary play all involve an element of imagination. Rough and tumble play. The children say they're fighting, but it's a pretend fight. They know it's a pretend fight, it's not a real fight. In constructive play, they say they're building a castle, but they know it's not a real castle. It's a pretend castle that they're building. In formal games with explicit rules, in that case, you are stepping into an already created imaginary world. So let's say you're playing a game of chess. You're now entering this imaginary world where, for example, bishops can only move on the diagonal. In the real world, bishops can move anywhere they want, but in The imaginary world of chess, they only move on the diagonal. So in all forms of play, you are exercising the capacity for imagination and for thinking hypothetically within this imaginary world. If this is true, then what else has to be true? And children are constantly exercising those mental abilities when they're playing. Imagination is the key to all higher order human thinking. It's basically what allows us to think in ways different from the ways other animals can think. Other animals can think about the here and now, about what's right in front of them. We can think about yesterday. We can think about tomorrow. We can think about possible worlds that we've never experienced. And that's what allows us to invent new things. That's what allows us to create new things. That's what allows scientists to develop hypotheses about things that they can't directly see. So this ability to imagine is really a key to higher order human thought. And what I'm arguing is children are practicing that all the time when they're playing. One way to think about this is to think about all the kinds of activities that we really admire in human beings. Think of, for example, an architect who develops a house. The architect, or a building for any purpose, the architect, before that house ever becomes a real house, first it's a pretend house in the architect's mind. The architect has to imagine what this would look like, what the layout would be, what the flow of people through the house would look like. This is all imagination. And then it maybe becomes a pretend house, a cardboard house, build a model of it. So there's a lot of play that precedes the actual construction of that house. The architect is engaging in imaginative play. Think of what a scientist does. Scientists don't just collect facts. They don't just report on what they observe. They develop theories about what they observe. So even something like gravity, you can't see gravity. Gravity is just an idea. It's just a made-up idea. It's a pure figment of one's imagination. But it explains a lot of things. And so when scientists come up with something like the idea of gravity, or the idea of Einstein coming up with the idea of relativity, they're coming up with something that they can't see, but which logically seems to have to be true to explain certain known facts, or at least it's the best explanation that we have for certain known facts. Einstein was famous for referring to all of his achievements in theoretical physics and in mathematics as combinatorial play. He said it's all play. He famously said that he came up with the idea of relativity, in part at least, by imagining himself chasing a sunbeam and imagining what would happen if he caught up with it. So by maintaining the imaginative capacities of a young child and combining that with all the mathematics and physics that he had learned, he came up with this amazing theory. There were other people who knew more mathematics and physics than he did, but they didn't have the same capacity for imagination that he had. Geniuses in every field seem to be those people who somehow retain into adulthood the childlike capacity to imagine things, to be creative about things, and combine that with all that they have learned as they are growing up. Fifth characteristic of play is that play is conducted in an alert, active, but non-stressed frame of mind. This final characteristic of play that I've listed here follows naturally from all the other characteristics. Because play occurs in an imaginary world, because there's no real world immediate consequences of it, because nobody's judging you, because you're not getting any kind of trophy for it, there's no stress involved. It doesn't matter if you fail. You're free to fail. So you're trying hard, you want to do the best you can, but it doesn't matter if you fail. And so the mind is active, but not stressed. The mind has to be active because, as I said, play is always attending to the means, always attending to the rules. You can't be passive and be a player. You have to be thinking about what you're doing all the time. It's being controlled. Play is always being controlled by your mind, and so your mind has to be active and engaged, but it's not overly stressed. This frame of mind, in which the mind is not stressed but is very active and engaged, is referred to by some psychologists as the state of flow, the flow state. And there's a lot of research that shows that people learn better, they think better, they're more creative when their mind is in that state of flow. This is the ideal state for learning new things. No stress, nobody evaluating you, but you are fully engaged in the thing that you are doing. And there's a lot of research on this, some of which I'll talk about in my talk this evening. But let me give you just one example of an experiment that shows how being in a playful state of mind can facilitate problem solving. This is a research study carried out by the American psychologist Alice Eisen a number of years ago. She was a professor at Cornell University, and she did a lot of research on problem solving. And one of the problems that she would have people solve in her studies is a problem called the candle problem. And it's an example of an insight problem where it seems like an impossible problem to solve until you suddenly have this sort of aha moment. I suddenly see the solution. It requires a sudden sort of act of creative solving to be able to see the solution to it. Those are called insight problems. So this candle problem is an example of such a problem. And the way it works is this. The person comes into the lab, and they are given a small candle, they're given a box of matches, and a box of tacks, or a book of matches and a box of tacks. And there is a bulletin board on the wall in the room that they're in. And they're told your job is to mount the candle on the bulletin board in such a way that the candle will be upright and you can light it and it will burn properly. Now, when she gives this problem to college students, and this is one of the Ivy League colleges, so these are supposedly very bright students, only on average 15% of students solve the problem within the time period that she gives them to solve the problem. On average, so 85% fail to solve this problem. The solution, if you haven't thought of it, is that you dump the tacks out of the tack box, you tack the tack box onto the bulletin board so it's now a shelf, and then you mount the candle on that shelf and light the candle. So in order to solve this problem, you have to be willing to imagine that tack box as something other than simply a holder of tacks. You have to imagine that tack box could be a shelf. You have to pretend it's something that it normally isn't, that it could be something that normally isn't. Now, interestingly, in one of her experiments, she had the students watch a short film before they went into the experiment. And in some cases, the film was a little slapstick comedy, designed, she said, to put them in a good mood, but I would argue more than a good mood, it put them in a playful mood. So watching a slapstick makes you think, oh, this isn't really like a test. We're just having fun in the laboratory today. Here's all this slapstick going on, and now I'm being asked to do this goofy thing of somehow mounting this candle. So it puts you in a playful mood. Others watched just a plain documentary or something that was kind of boring, and others didn't watch any film at all. What she found was that those who would watch just this short slapstick comedy, just for a few minutes, 75% of them solved the problem correctly, compared to 15%, again, in the other groups. An amazing difference, a huge difference. Suddenly, many more people were able to solve the problem. She talks about it as because they're in a good mood, but I think it's because they are in a playful mood. When you are in a playful mood, then it's easy to imagine something being other than what it normally is. That's what play is all about. You're always imagining things being other than what it normally is. You're always stepping out of the box, if you will, when you are playing. And so when you're in a playful mood, that's the mental set for solving these kinds of problems. So it's not surprising to me that great scientists are able to solve these kinds of problems when they're in a playful mood and when they can bring a playful attitude to what they're doing, which they wouldn't be able to do if they were just always thinking seriously about it. So I want now to talk about, I go from, on the handout, we're now, if you're on the second page of the handout, we're now down to this point I make here, C here. The power of play lies in its triviality. The power of play lies in its triviality. You know, we tend to think of play as trivial. And when we think of it as trivial, there's a certain sense in which we are right. It is trivial. It's trivial because it's not getting us anything that we really need in the moment. We're not getting food, we're not getting shelter, we're not getting any money, we're not getting any praise for it by definition, because if we were getting any of those things, it wouldn't be play anymore. It's not something that's adding to our resume. It's completely trivial. It doesn't count. My argument is it's precisely because it doesn't count that it's so powerful, it's so amazing. Because it doesn't count, the child feels free to try things that the child wouldn't feel free to try if it mattered. It's precisely because it doesn't count that the child feels emboldened to do this thing that the child otherwise wouldn't do. That the person feels emboldened to think in this creative way because it doesn't matter if you're wrong. When it's a serious situation, that's not the time to try something different. When it's a playful situation, that's the time to try something different. And so whenever you're learning something new, whenever you're trying to be creative, whenever you're trying to do something that's not already an ingrained habit in you, you can do it better if you're in a playful mood because it doesn't count. Then you can do it if you are in a serious mood where you think that it really matters how you perform. The play world is a simulation world for the child. It's a safe world to practice the skills and ideas, to play at being a different kind of person. It's a safe world to try things out, precisely because it doesn't count. Because nobody's grading it, nobody's judging you for it, nobody's going to praise you if you do well, and nobody's going to criticize you if you don't do well. So play is this simulation. Now, play is trivial in that sense, but it is never easy. And the reason play isn't easy is because it gets boring if it's easy. Children are always playing at the cutting edge of their ability. So think of a little toddler who is just kind of learning to walk. And just like children learn everything in play, they learn to walk in play. So the toddler is playfully walking back and forth, maybe between those two chairs there, just stepping a couple of steps, grabbing one chair, then walking back to the other chair. Once the toddler can do that well, the toddler doesn't keep doing that. The toddler stops. Now the toddler can walk. Now the toddler moves on to some more difficult form of locomotor play. Maybe climbing the stairs over here, or maybe skipping, or maybe jumping. The toddler is continuously motivated to play at ever higher levels of motivation. Or think of teenagers playing video games. The teenager doesn't stupidly play the same level of video game over and over and over again. It would just get boring. Once you know how to play that game, it's no longer any fun anymore. The teenager goes to ever higher levels of the game where new complexities are raised, new difficulties are raised. The teenager is constantly stretching his mental ability as he goes from one level to another of the video game. Einstein didn't dumbly keep solving the same kind of problem. He kept going on. Once he could solve one kind of problem, that was no longer challenging anymore. He went on to more and more difficult problems all the time. So in every form of play, play is only play if it's fun, and if you can already do it so well, then it's no longer fun anymore. It's no longer any part of play is the challenge of being able to do it. That's a lot of the fun of the play, the challenge of being able to do something that's difficult for you to do. So children are always at the cutting edge of their abilities when they are playing. So I want to in Roman numeral 3 here, I'm going to just be very quick. I want here just to kind of, in a way, summarize what I've been through. In the workshop tonight, I'm going to talk more about these things that are in Roman numeral 3, about the way play promotes different kinds of development. But right now, I just want to use this to sort of review what we've been through. I talked about play and physical development. I didn't have to talk much about that. It's so obvious that in physical play, that's how children develop their physical bodies. Children are not designed to run laps. They're not designed to lift weights. They're not designed, those things are boring even to me. They're not designed to swim back and forth laps in a pool. They're designed to chase one another around, to climb trees, to roughhouse, to play fight, to do all these things that are thrilling and exciting to them, not to do boring workouts. And the way that children develop their physical bodies is through physical play, not through physical education, not through physical education. So the play and intellectual development I've just been describing, being able to think creatively, being able to think logically and hypothetically, being able to bring imagination to bear, is all part of the intellectual development that occurs through play. Play and social moral development, the learning how to negotiate as you decide what you're going to play, learning to pay attention to your playmate, whether your playmate is having fun or not, and therefore acquiring the skills of empathy and overcoming narcissism. Really key to being able to get along with other people. You know, if you can't do that, I mean, that's probably that's certainly one, maybe the most important skill that human beings develop, way more important than knowing how to read, is knowing how to tell whether somebody else that you are involved with is having fun or not. If you can't do that, you can't have a good marriage. If you can't do that, you can't have real friends. If you can't do that, you will never have real good work partners. This ability to get into the mind of another person and tell whether they're in sync with you, to tell whether they're happy with what's going on or not, is the key to our social existence. And children are practicing that all the time, and it's way more important than knowing how to read. You can have a successful life without knowing how to read. You can't have a successful life if you don't know how to get along with other people. So play and social moral development, play and emotional development. Children are learning how to experience fear and overcome fear. Children sometimes get angry in play. And if they get angry in play and have a tantrum or have a fight or something like that, that ends the play. But they don't want to end the play. Children are motivated to continue playing. So in play, in the context of play, they learn how to control their anger. They learn how to assert, oh, you hurt me. You know, you really hit me too hard as we were rough and tumbling. I'm not going to play with you if you continue doing that. That's a much better response than my just hitting back. If I just hit back, then it results in a fight. Now, I might hit back, and it might result in a fight, and then the play ends. Oh, that's too bad. You know, so next time, maybe I won't hit back. Maybe I'll say, oh my God, you know, you really hurt me. I'm not going to play with you anymore if you hit that hard. And then we have a discussion about it. So children learn how to be assertive rather than violent in the course of play. Not all children learn that as easily as other children. And some children, I don't want to idealize children. Children do have fights in play. But it is our mistake if we think it's our job always to watch and break up those fights. It's often better to let the children figure out how to resolve it themselves. We are far too quick, we adults in our society today, to always step in and solve children's problems for them, and that's what kind of teaches them that they are incapable of solving their own problems. It's much better, generally speaking, to let children figure out how to solve their own problems so they develop an internal sense of control. So I'm going to just wrap this part of the meeting up with this conclusion. I hope that I've convinced you, if you weren't already convinced, that free play, children's play unfettered by adults, is crucially important to their healthy physical development, their healthy social and moral development, their healthy intellectual development, their healthy emotional development. All aspects of human development are promoted by play. Play came about in the course of the evolution of our species as the way that children develop all aspects of themselves. We now have a world in which children, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's in the United States, are less free to play in the ways that children are designed to play than children have ever been before in the history of the world, with the exception of times and places where children were slaves or where children were in sweatshops or other work environments where they had to work large amounts of the day. You know, isn't it ironic that years ago, and I'm talking now about the United States, I don't know the time course here in Hong Kong, but in the United States, it was about 100 years ago that we decided that child labor beyond a certain number of hours a week was child abuse, and that children should be allowed the freedom to play, and that they needed that, and it was wrong to make children work for long hours. But you know what we've done? Since then, we've replaced that child labor with something that for many children is even more odious. They are in school often for even longer than their parents are at work. They would gladly change their job at school for the job of their parents. So we've freed them from what we called child labor, and now we've put them into a kind of senseless child labor in which they're doing stuff that's kind of meaningless to them over and over and over again. We've gotten ourselves into a kind of trap. And we need now to figure out how to get out of the trap. There's no reason under the sun why children need to be spending so many hours in school and at doing academic work. That stuff is easy to learn compared to the learning that I've been describing that has to come through play. And the learning that comes through play is joyous and fun, and it's what children are designed to do. So at this point, I'm going to stop, and thank you very, very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Gray. It's our pleasure and honor. I want to know, is there any differentiation between play and the experiential learning that we recently hear quite a lot? And also, is there any spiritual advantages or benefits for, play for the children?
I'm sorry.
First one is there any differentiation about play and the experiential learning that we hear quite a lot these days? And the second one is, are there any spiritual values of play? Because we hear about like physical, intellectual, social, moral, as well as emotion. How about the spiritual
value
one? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, play, of course, is always experiential. So play involves experiential learning. I think, though, I think that we almost bend over backwards to avoid the word play, to avoid thinking about play, to avoid the idea of let's just let children play. And then sometimes the closest we can come to that is to call it experiential learning. And we don't really quite dare let the kids actually just play. So instead, we try to guide the experiences. We're going to create certain experiences for them, or we're going to guide them into particular experiences. And that's certainly useful. That's better than if they're just doing abstract stuff in the classroom. I certainly promote that, but it doesn't replace play, because it's still generally something that the adults are setting up for the kids, rather than the kids making their own real choices, completely solving their own problems, generating their own activity. And that's really what children learn in play. That's the important things that children learn in play, that they don't necessarily learn in the experiential activities that are set up by adults. The other thing that children, of course, do in play that I didn't even talk about, I talked more about this yesterday, is that they discover what they really like to do. They discover, play by definition is sort of doing what you like to do. And you play at various things and you find you really like to do this, and they develop passions and passionate interests. And ideally then they even can go on and and follow this as a career. Now, experiential learning might do that to some extent if you have enough different experiences. But to the degree that you are setting up the experiences, for some children, they may find, oh, this particular kind of experience, this is really fun and I really love this. But for another child, it might not be so interesting. So in play, the different children would do different things. They wouldn't all be doing the same kind of, engage in the same kind of experience. In terms of spiritual development, that's a really interesting question. And to be honest, I haven't given a lot of thought to it. But I do think that, part of spiritual development, I guess, is sort of having a sense of there being something in the world more important than the immediate here and now, more important than yourself, kind of some sense of larger connectedness to the world. I mean, there's different ways people talk about spiritual world. Some people would think of it in more humanitarian terms. Some people would think of it in terms of connections to God and so on. And so depending upon your upbringing and your experiences with religion, you would think about it differently. But I think in a very broad sense of the term, I think that play does help connect you to all aspects of this larger world. You begin to see things, I guess one way to look at it is, to the degree that we are spiritual, we are not just concerned with our immediate material well-being. We're not just concerned with making money. We're not just concerned with getting praise. We're not just concerned with all these immediate things. And play does kind of elevate you beyond all of these things, because when you're involved in play, you're involved in something that's fun for its own sake. And you are also involved in something that involves imagination, and through imagination you can connect yourselves in whatever way, whether you're connecting yourself to the globe or to nature, or thinking of yourself as connecting yourself to God. Whatever way you're thinking of yourself, that is a kind of playful way of thinking about the world. I actually have one blog post, if anybody's interested in pursuing it, on my Psychology Today blog. I have a post in which I argue that all religion in root is play. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from that. Some religious people don't like that idea. But since I really value play, I think play is the highest, and the playful state of mind is the highest state of mind we can have. To me, that's not a put down of religion. To me, that's an elevation of religion. That religion involves always a certain kind of an imagination. In a sense, religion is always make-believe. Religion is faith. Religious is based on faith. What is faith? Faith is to believe something without evidence. You don't need evidence. You just believe it. And to believe something without evidence is to make believe, and that's play. So.
Well, wait a second. Hello, can you hear me? Yep, okay. And actually, when Peter is talking so much, many theories and findings and research about play, and actually Peter you didn't always think like that. It's like a recent decades that you started believe and doing research about play, because Peter's also a parent, right? So like many of us here today, when we were struggling, well, shall I give more time for them to play, for my children to play? Or if you're a teacher, play seems a waste of time. That's what most teachers may think, is a very precious time. So how Peter changed, from maybe you were more like that before? I don't know whether you have ever been like that before, but to now that you actually do so many research in the last decades to become like advocates in terms of play.
So you want me to comment on that? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm stealing one question from you. Sorry about that. Because I thought for many parents who are still struggling with the thought, it might be a good reference to see why he has got this change to such an extent.
Well, let me describe two experiences that I've had that have led me to be interested in play. One of the experiences, as I said at the beginning of my talk, when I was growing up, play was what kids did. Everybody played. You played most of the time. You were out there playing with other kids. I I often say that when I was a child, I had two educations. I had school, but school was the less important of the two educations. The other education was what I sometimes call the hunter-gatherer education. And that's being out there with other kids, doing what kids do, doing all kinds of things, getting into trouble, figuring out how to get out of trouble, all of these things that children do when they're not being guarded and directed by adults. Of those two educations, there's no question, and I think I've always understood that hunter-gatherer education was the more important education. When I think of what abilities I have today, what kinds of skills, I can think of them far more easily how they relate to what I was doing in play than what I was doing in school. And I think I've always understood that. But I never really thought about it deeply or actually did a lot of research on it. And then I had an experience a few years ago when my wife and my first wife died and I remarried, and my second wife had two children, and sort of to cement our new family, we decided to take a trip to the Dominican Republic. And so we went to the Dominican Republic, and it's the first time I'd ever been there. And I saw all these kids outdoors. This was about 15 years ago. I saw all these kids outdoors playing without any adults around. They were playing in the street, they were playing in fields, they were everywhere playing. And it suddenly struck me, that's the way I used to play. And I don't see that in America anymore. That was when I first realized, because the change is gradual. It's like watching the minute hand on a clock. You don't see it move. You have to look away and then you look back, and it has really moved so much. I hadn't really noticed that until it suddenly struck me, wow, there has been this enormous change in our culture. And that's what led me to do the research that I described at the beginning of this talk. Has this been documented that play has declined to the degree that it has? And what might be the consequences of that? Are there other changes in the psychology of children and young adults that might be the result of this decline in play? So that led me to that kind of research. The other event that led me to think about, especially about schooling and about play, occurred before this. This was with my own biological son, who went to the regular public school. It was supposedly a good school in a suburban neighborhood. Everybody thought it was a good school. My son absolutely rebelled in school. From kindergarten on, he absolutely rebelled. He hated school. And he was very articulate about hating school. He said it was prison, and I was sending him to prison. Every day I was sending him to prison. And he was very clear about it. And when nothing was done about it, when I didn't rescue him from this prison, he began to rebel in ways that were terribly annoying to the teachers and even to the other kids. So, for example, whenever the teacher told him to do something in one way, he would find a different way to do it. It was the only way he could find to make it interesting. So he would always find a different way to do it. If they were doing arithmetic and she would show them how you're supposed to solve these problems and you're supposed to show your work, he would do it in an entirely different way that the teacher couldn't understand how he did it. And it really annoyed her. He'd get the right answer, but it bothered her, and she would count it wrong because he didn't do it the right way. And the teachers would bring me and his mother in as if it's sort of our fault. We've raised this monster of a child who refuses to follow directions. And when it came time to learn punctuation and capital letters, he decided to write like the poet E.E. Cummings. I don't know if you know E.E. Cummings, but he puts capitals wherever he pleases, and that's his method of writing, and punctuation wherever he pleases, or doesn't use them at all. And my son Scott began to do that. And so in all of these ways, he was being a brat, to be honest. He was doing exactly the opposite of what he was being told to do. And so he finally, it reached a real crisis point. We were I tell this story at the beginning of my book, but we were in the teachers didn't know what to do with him. They decided, so we're going to have this meeting in the principal's office in the school. So his mother is there, I'm there, His classroom teacher is there, the school psychologist is there, the principal, the assistant principal, some other psychologist brought inside, all these big adults there. And our task was to tell little Scott, little 9-year-old Scott, that in no uncertain terms he has to do what he's told to do in school. He has no choice about it, he has to do what he's told to do in school. So we all said our piece. And he looked at us big, smart adults, he looked at all of us, and he said, "Go to hell." And I began to cry, and his mother began to cry. And we looked at one another, and we knew at that moment that he was right. That was the insight to us. He was right. School, at least for him, if not for everybody, at least for him, school was prison. And we were fighting on the wrong side if we were to try to make him continue doing that. So then we realized we had to take him out of school. We had to rescue him from what he considered to be prison. And we found this school nearby. It was within walking distance, only 2 or 3 miles from where we lived, called the Sudbury Valley School. And this is a school that is as different as you can possibly imagine from a typical school. It's basically a place where children from age 4 on through teenage years are allowed to play and explore and pursue their own interests without being judged, without any tests, without any curriculum, without any required courses, to their heart's content. And he was delightedly happy there. He felt this is exactly what a school should be. He totally understood it immediately. I did not understand it immediately. I was concerned. I thought, okay, he's happy, that's great. But is he going to be able to go on in life as a successful adult later on in life? Is he going to learn the things that he has to learn? So that led me to be interested in what happens to the graduates of this school. And so as a result of that, I did a study. Already at that time, the school had been in existence for about 15 years, and there were quite a number of people who had graduated from the school and had gone on either to higher education or to some careers. There were about 80 such people, and I did a study in which I was able to locate almost all of them. And it was a study in which I really was concerned because I really wanted to find out if they weren't doing well in life, I wouldn't have wanted my son to stay there. I would have done everything I could to get him to go someplace else. What I discovered absolutely amazed me. The graduates of the school were doing very well in life. They were going on to higher education if they chose to do so. They didn't all choose to do so. Many chose careers and were doing very well in careers that didn't require higher education. Most importantly, they seemed to be very happy in life. They seemed definitely to be in control of their own life. You know, I talked about internal, external locus of control. These are people who seem to believe and seem to be really feel in charge of their own life and take charge of their own life and doing well in life. And so that led me to really an interest in play. That's where my interest in studying play came about, because now I wanted to know, well, they're just playing around here and socializing and pursuing their own interests, and somehow they're becoming educated. How is this happening? And that led me to do a lot of research, much of it at the school, some of it elsewhere, about how play really promotes education, how children learn so much. Among other things, as I talked about yesterday, this was more my topic yesterday, is how children learn to read and play, how they learn to write, how they learn numbers and mathematics, how they learn these things that we think are so hard to teach in school and they have to be taught by drill and all of that. So that was kind of those were the experiences, my own personal experiences, that led to my interest in the topics that I've been talking about.
So, next one? Yep. This lady in green. Yes.
Thanks for your sharing in the talk. And a lot of examples that you mentioned today involve playing with kids of the similar age, maybe. Is playing alone still play? And is playing with adults play?
Great questions.
Yeah.
First of all, I should say that yesterday evening in the workshop that I held, the topic was the value of age-mixed play. I actually think that the best forms of play are when children are playing with other children but across a wide range of age. The reason I think this school that I've studied works so well is because the school doesn't segregate children by age, so there are children there from age 4 on through about 18. And they're playing together, and in the context of that play, the little children are learning from the older children. They're constantly being boosted up to higher activities. And the older children are learning in many ways from the younger children in ways that I talked about yesterday. I won't go into details. So I think age-mixed play is very valuable. And most of the play, you're right, that I've talked about is social play. Now, solitary play is also valuable, but when children have the opportunity, in most parts, historically, children always were exposed to other children. There are always lots of other children around. And when there are a lot of other children around, children generally prefer to play with other children most of the time. And so I would say that by biological design, most play is social play, partly because many of the most important things you have to learn in play are how to get along with other people, how to be social. We're social animals. So children are born with a drive to play with other children. Natural selection created that drive. However, in all parts of the world, children spend a certain amount of time in solo play. There's certain kinds of things that you really want to intensely. You don't even want to be interrupted. You just want to do this thing all by yourself. It might be constructive play. You want to build this thing, and you want to build it the way you want to build it. You don't want to have to compromise with somebody else. You just want to do it your own way. And so that kind of play, that whether it's artistic, drawing, or whether it's musical play, or whether it's building a sandcastle, but you want to build your own sandcastle the way you want to build it, that is also very, very valuable. But I don't think that solo play substitutes for social play. Social play is really, really important. And throughout most of history, social play was natural. You just went outdoors. Even when I was a kid in the 1950s in the United States, you just went outdoors, and there's kids everywhere, and you would go and play with them. But nowadays, it's much harder, at least in the United States. We live in more isolated families. People are indoors more often. People are afraid to let their kids outdoors, so you send a kid outdoors and he doesn't find anybody to play with, and so you kind of have to almost set up play dates, and that's so artificial. It ruins play in many ways. You're not so free to quit or to choose your own playmates, So I think we need to somehow create the kind of world in which social play, real social play, is much more possible for children than it currently is, at least than it currently is in the United States. I can't speak for Hong Kong.
Thank you. Trust is the thing, and where does the trust come from? From knowing your child. And how to know your child? Give them some time, I guess, really to look at your child. I think we have one more question. Yep.
Professor Gray, I'm glad you brought up all the examples that you just did, because it also relates to my question. I have not personally been at the Sudbury Valley School or know anybody who did. So I'm just wondering, while we talk about the free play, which I really like the concept, or actually not just the concept, but in real practice. On the other hand, I'm wondering at school, or maybe for parents at home, who subscribe to this way of educational philosophy or bringing up children, how do you balance between giving guidance and giving freedom to the child? For example, at the school, are they free to just stay in the basketball court all day if they really like basketball? And they are freely, make the choice whether to go to a class or 2 classes or 3 classes in the whole day, or at home, they will be playing free play again all day long, or do you give some guidance as to, you have to do certain academic work, at home, in a day or certain days of the week and so on?
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you how it works at Sudbury Valley and what the observation is there. And this really surprises people, and it surprised me. I mean, it really was a surprise to me. Here's a school where really and truly children are free all day long to do what they choose to do, as long as they don't break the school rules. And the school rules are all made democratically, so every student has a vote on any rules that get passed. The rules don't have anything to do with learning. There are no rules that have to do with learning. The rules all have to do with things like not littering, not bullying, not defacing property. You take toys out, you have to put them away. But there's no rule saying that you have to study anything. There's no courses even offered. Sometimes a group of students will get together and they'll want to study something or talk about something as a group, and they'll form a little course, and they might ask a staff member to be part of the course or even to lead the course, and the staff member will agree to do that. But in principle, a child could spend all day, day after day after day after day, doing nothing, just sitting there, or just playing video games, or just watching television. In principle, they could do that. And indeed, there are some children, if you look at the Sudbury Valley School website, I don't know if they still have it, but there used to be a film on the first page, a video of a former student who was talking about how he spent 2 years doing essentially nothing but playing video games. Nothing but video games. So the typical parent would look at that and say, that's atrocious. This is negligence that somebody would just be playing video games, nothing else during all that time. I don't believe it was totally nothing else. I think that's impossible. But it was essentially nothing else, at least during the school day. And he talked about what he was learning from that. And then he went on to some other things, and he applied some of the very same skills that he learned in video games to other things, and went on. And I could tell story after story of children who got absorbed in something. Here, let me give you another example. Here, there was one of the children at the school, in my study of the graduates of the school, and I learned about this from him, but I also learned about him by talking to staff members. Here was a student at the school who for years, basically all he did was build things. He built plasticine models of factories and so on, and he would get staff members to take him to the dump and bring back bicycle parts, and then he would build bicycles from it. Did nothing academically. He didn't seem to be interested in reading. I mean, he would read a little bit as it related to the things that he was building, but no other kind of reading. He went on he went on to become a machinist, and all the skills he developed building things went into his becoming a machinist. And then became an inventor. He became the kind of person you would go to if you needed somebody to build a machine that nobody else had ever built. And was living a very successful, very happy life doing what he really loved to do. So what happens, what I'm trying to illustrate with this example, and there are many other examples I could give, is those children who don't seem to be living a balanced life as children, they seem to be doing just one kind of thing, maybe we don't have to worry about them. They're people who have what you call a passion. They wouldn't be doing that thing if they didn't love it and if they weren't getting something from it. Those are the people who go on to be the real achievers in our society. Who cares if they know how to do arithmetic, if they can do great art? Who cares if they don't know how to do great art, if they can do great arithmetic? This idea that we have that everybody has to do something of everything, that they all have to have a balanced life, is an idea that seems to be disproved by the Sudbury Valley School. Everybody learns the skills that you have to learn to make it through life. They learn how to balance their checkbook. They learn how to make change so they don't get cheated when they're buying something. Everybody learns that. Everybody learns how to read to the degree that you have to read, but some people will become great readers. Everybody learns how to write to the degree that you have to write, but some people become great writers, and others, it's not a relevant aspect to their life. So one of the things that you have to accept if you're going to send your child to a Sudbury school is you have no control over your child's future. You are giving up that control to the child. The child is now responsible for his own life. And my whole argument is that works out best. people need to feel in charge of their own life. If they feel controlled, if they feel that somebody else is controlling their life, making their decisions for them, then they don't develop this internal sense of control. And that sets them up for anxiety, for depression. It sets them up for not doing so well in life. So, you know, it's a really good question, and the answer is counterintuitive to a lot of people. But the experience, the Sudbury Valley School has now been in existence for about almost 50 years. There are hundreds of graduates, and for every story is a completely different story. And there are many children who one would have looked at them at some point, and if you were looking at them from the usual schoolish point of view, you would assume they're going to amount to nothing because they're not doing any of the kinds of things that you think is important for them to do. But they're doing something that's important to them and that is giving them meaning in life, and then they are going on and making the life that they want to make for themselves.